as with Heather, this will be a slightly different talk in that while I started my life in academia as a theoretical neuroscientist, most recently at UC Berkeley. If, by the way, you don't know what theoretical neuroscientist means, just insert the word lazy for theoretical, and you have a pretty good idea. Once I learned that you could just simulate brains on computers and you didn't have to stick wires in cats, I just thought, hell yes, this is the career for me. It was just coincidence that essentially a lot of the work in deep neural networks came out of my field, and I was well positioned to then become what a lot of people in the Bay Area inevitably do, whether they want to or not, which is become an entrepreneur. So for the last 12 years, I have been starting companies. And my first of my companies was looking at whether we could use artificial intelligence to replace high-stakes tests, which we know are biased, which we know are only very predictive of the next stage of high-stakes tests that will come along. They do a lot of nice signaling for you, but they don't, in fact, add anything to anyone's life. If you want to start an ed tech company, that depends on what you want to do. If you want to make a successful business, go into test prep. You want to change someone's life, don't go into test prep. So this was my first company. The next one was using machine learning techniques to figure out in a professional context, not who you do know, but who you ought to know. So you're going to your biggest conference in your field of the year. Who are the 5 people that you've never met before that you ought to meet, and why? Next company, we were tackling bias in the workforce. We were trying to help companies hire some of the best talent at the most elite banks and tech companies in the world. And then my next company, we're in the gig economy. So I don't believe, by the way, in the gig economy. It may seem strange then to found a company there. This company is called ShiftGig, and 40% of our workforce you might describe as otherwise unemployable. They dropped out of high school. They don't have any particular skill set to get a job. Another 30% are single moms that try to get jobs and then lose them, and then try and then lose them over and over again because of the need for flexibility in their lives. And the last is underemployed college students with massive debt. And all they're trying to do is earn a little extra money to pay that off. That's an interesting one for what I'm going to get into here, because what we saw was that spending 2 years working at ShiftGig did nothing for you. Which is, I'm saying this about my own company. Hopefully they never see this video. But I mean, it helped pay your rent for 2 years. But we didn't see any change in your hourly earnings. We didn't see any change, meaningful change in the skills you brought to the marketplace afterwards. If you worked for us because no one else would hire you, 2 years later, you're still working for us. Or Uber, everyone, all of the gig economy at this level have the same sets of employees, all for the same reasons. 3 archetypes, and what do you do to transform this workforce? What I'd like to do in this talk is essentially recast the talk I was originally going to give into everyone else's talks, because I could easily spend 8 hours just going back through what everyone else has brought up in excruciating detail, because this is really what I care about in my life. And so I'm going to try and take the stuff I've worked on and put it back in this framework. But if you want a sense of where we're about to go, it is this not so simple statement. It's not just opportunity, but choice itself is fundamentally inequitably distributed. If we think as a magic wand, Americans or anyone else in the world will just make these magical rational choices, and we'll choose to go to the right schools and study hard and work on the right things and end up in great jobs, then I have a copious amount of psychological and sociological research to share with you that unfortunately is hopefully going to disabuse you of that notion. But in some ways it paints a fairly bleak picture. So when we had, unfortunately he's gone now, but we'll have a revisit to some of the shift findings and this idea, for example, that there will be these potential new economies in front of us. And I had suggested at the end of that, maybe we'll see a mix of them. So I'm not much of a futurist, but let me lay this out for you. As a rational future I see in front of us, it is the king of the hill for about 1% of the workforce. So a phenomenal competition for top creative talent that will go on amongst an increasingly smaller set of companies as some of this agglomeration and concentration takes place. And I've had every one of those companies reach out and try to hire me in the past, largely to manage the sort of computational side of their HR life, and to see the precision, sophistication that they bring to these things, frankly, should be scary to everyone else, because boy, that is hard to compete against. But this is the framework we find ourselves in, and the other side, the other 99%, I'm not actually all that worried about job loss. Yes, tasks will be automated away. Every one of my companies has been based on some AI mechanism. My very first project was automating lie detection for the CIA as an undergrad. So not that we shed a tear over it, but there were a bunch of CIA analysts for whom that was their job, highly trained to review video and see whether someone was lying or not. And we automated that. That company, by the way, now drives all of the new face recognition stuff on iPhone. So my undergraduate lab spun out as a startup, and it is now dumb animated cat videos. That's innovation in the real world. So I don't see job loss in these spaces. I actually think the other 99%, well, hey, there's always subsistence farming. So there's always going to be something for you to do. I love driving through Nairobi, and everyone tells me, look how entrepreneurial our young men are as they're out there, selling sliced fruit and washing cars on the side of the road. And, I don't say this to be a rude guest, but isn't that because there's 40% unemployment amongst young men in Kenya right now? It's the same story in many places around the world. I don't think of that as entrepreneurship. I think of that as necessity. So one last little story here. Some friends of mine started a company. They do deep neural networks for sonograms. So originally they were building the actual hardware themselves, in fact. So you just have the sonogram, you run it over it, and it's what I call the AI bait and switch. So one vision here is the super GP, this amazing doctor who before you ever come into the office with all the wearables, they're already collecting that data. They're working on prognosis, they're working on treatment. It's preventative, it's everything you can imagine. When you finally get in, they don't refer you off to the neurologist. Right there, they whip out the wand, they run it over you, all the diagnostics right there. So here's the switch, which I think my extrapolation from all of this I've ever researched and what we've seen today is that this is the overwhelming economic trend in the world, is the sort of CFO vision, which is, geez, can't we just hire 3 lab techs, give them all this wand, and then they can see 3 times as many patients, and we'll just give them a printout of what they're supposed to do? So this is overwhelmingly what we actually see happen. Why has automation not led to significant drops in productivity, or maybe even, in this scenario, total job increases? But in the comments I was making earlier, I think slightly misunderstanding the question I asked, what happens when the political force of the entire professional class is undermined by deprofessionalization facilitated through the AI switch? And then you have this mass of people that used to be part of the, part of this balancing act of what makes our country and our community. Now one of those is knocked out. And then, with the for-profit education industry, which I believe is the new title of the Department of Education, in place, you'd see that there actually are very few pillars on which this system is based anymore. So it sounds like I'm going to head towards a dismal statement here and just wait till my next slide. But in fact, I'm here to give much more of a solutions talk. I don't think anything I'm going to talk about is going to be easy. I might use the word we every now and then, but I mean it in the same way you do. Far be it from me as an entrepreneur to just decide for all of us what the solution should be. I'm happy to invent this stuff, but we need to decide what actually happens in a much more pluralistic way. And then one other element that hasn't come up, it's been mentioned a few times, but hasn't come up as much, is sort of we're talking about multiple populations here. So I already got into this. You know, we have the jump rope for 99% of us, little certainty, lots of effort, little jobs, they're available to many people, and then this competition, and then a chasm in between. Are you worth more than an AI, or are you worth less? And I think from a sociological and psychological perspective, that is a profound division on which to base our civilization. So I do believe that there are things we can do to redirect these outcomes. It's not the current trend, but I fundamentally believe. But let's start with the dismal. Okay, so this is not a happy statement. I wrote a short story, and I was asked to write an op-ed about how AI will affect the future of work. And I wrote it, and it didn't really have the heart that I wanted it to. So I rewrote it as a short story and submitted that unsolicited. And fortunately, they didn't hate me, and they published it. And there was a story of a young man on his last day of work as a financial analyst. And a lot of the graphs we've seen today have been about how automation is tied to the level of education in your work, the level of sort of sophistication as represented by hourly wage. Well, I'm already laid out here. I see the biggest, most devastating impacts will be in the professional services. Doctors, lawyers, financial industry. This stuff is complex, but not all of it, but the vast majority of it is lever pulling. It is the moment, you know, a wills specialist sees their client walk in the door, they got one of 3 templates, and their whole job is just figure out which will template they're going to be right for this person, or a risk assessment, or basic. So again, you'll see a split. The people that do this with a deep level of passion are going to, and with skill, they're going to move up into this highly competitive economy, and everyone else will be pushed down. And then the words you hear is upskilling. So, and we're going to train you. Well, you know, here's the sad story. I don't know exactly. Most job retraining is based on this idea of like a 6-week boot camp to get you up to speed because we can't afford anything more than that. Well, you're not going to change anything about anyone's lives in 6 weeks, just period. So you really want to know what it takes. It takes a couple of years. That's Raj Chetty's been mentioned many times. He had a great piece of work showing that teachers' increase in productivity in terms of their strong positive impact on their students really took at least 3 years. And that he was on the low end of most people's estimates. So you really want to build highly skilled dynamic workforce. This takes years. Well, it takes someone like me roughly 2 years to go from concept to a new AI deployment. So that's not great math. If it takes years, possibly realistically 30 years to build a human, and it takes an asshole like me 2 years to replace them, how are you going to keep retraining everyone? Yeah, I threw that in there. So, so this is not good. What I'm not saying here is people aren't worth anything. I actually fundamentally believe, that everyone can change. Most of you here are academics. If you do that, if you teach classes and you don't believe that everyone should change, you should get a new job. That is the fundamental belief of education, is everyone can change. And I believe it with all of my heart. But right now, the assumption is you will change because it's in your best interest and it's all on you. Well, that's a totally different story. The core of that story is the belief that your hard work will pay off. One of my fun projects I got to do on my own was I built a little AI. I do a lot of these things. I build treatments for diabetes and bipolar disorder just because they ought to be out there. So in this case, I was not very satisfied. Let's pull Raj Chetty again and James Heckman and others. I wasn't very satisfied with this explanation that the reason women drop out of the workforce is because they want to raise families. Both very progressive economists, both coming to the same conclusion. I've read their papers. I thought that explains what they did, but not why. Why do women drop out of the workforce? Why is this pay gap? Why do students from underrepresented backgrounds get full scholarships to Stanford and Harvard and then don't take them at rates that just don't reflect anything what the traditional student does? And the number one reason is the belief that their hard work will pay off. We went through, I built a little AI, it crawled through the websites of 60,000 companies, and we did a facial analysis of their leadership team, their board, and their C-suite. Number one predictor of the variance between companies and pay gap was how many women were in those pictures. If you're working twice or 3 times as hard as the guy next to you, and then you look up and there's no one like you, no reason to believe that this is ever going to pay off, suddenly that option of choosing to raise a family becomes really attractive. You're top student at your high school, straight A's, full scholarship to Harvard, and then you don't go. Oh, well, black families are culturally different. No, Hispanic families, the economics is total. My dad grew up in nowhere, Kansas. Graduated at the top of his class for the whole state of Kansas, for all I know, 12 people, in 1957. Actually, there's a lot more in 1957, to be perfectly honest. And he got a full scholarship to MIT. Straight, white guy, obviously. Well, he didn't go because, in the words of my grandparents, what's the point? What's the point of going to MIT if you're just going to end up back on the farm? He went to KU, he tutored Wilt Chamberlain in chemistry. Well, Vietnam War changed his life, and I grew up a Californian. But, you know, it seems irrational. Why would anyone not make that choice? What's the point? In boring behavioral economics terms, we call this belief-based utility. Utility is not a fixed thing. That's the same function for everyone. It depends on what your life experiences have been. And if you want to change whether someone is going to take advantage of an educational opportunity or an educational technology, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm already eating up all of my time and I haven't really gotten into the talk. You need to change their belief that their hard work will pay off, because even the good stuff is hard work. And it's hard to change that. So one of the companies we built was called Guild. I mentioned earlier this idea of recruiters giving you 5 seconds and looking at your name, your school, and your last job. So that was Guild. We built a database of 122 million people. I was the chief scientist. We use these very large, sophisticated machine learning systems, first off, just to figure out, when we pulled data, if you want to know where my data comes from, the first time I ever met Reid Hoffman, I introduced myself, and he said, I know you. I don't like you. We would borrow heavily from LinkedIn and Facebook and Google. We'd pull in blog posts and tweets, everything we could find about people. The open source code that they wrote, the tweet evidence of their sales history, anything and everything. And then we had a lot of fairly sophisticated AIs to actually make certain it was all the same person. So we built this giant database, and then we looked what actually predicted the best work, not career trajectories. Career trajectories is a simple story. Just predict who his company will hire. Predict white guys, generally straight, a little bit of flexibility if they're Asian, and you're in good shape. And they went to the right school. If you want to actually predict the quality of work that they do, turns out none of that was informative. Not the school, not the name, not the test scores, not the skill sets, which are the focal point of so much of education. And so we started mining through all of this stuff and looking for these predictors. And it turns out they end up being very deep qualities about people. So let me start with, I don't know if anyone has a misspent youth and knows who this is. This guy is arguably the greatest skateboarder of all time. Won 59 world championships in a row. So in some of my work, I've done some collaborative stuff with Red Bull. He nowadays does Red Bull. His name is Rodney Mullen. And he and I had lunch once. And I thought, I got a big question for him. Rodney, you just won your 40th world championship in a row. Rodney loves to party. And he clearly at the time was not afraid of ever getting beaten by anyone. You just won your 40th in a row. What do you do that night? He says, well, Tony Hawk and I, we go to the after party and we drink a little champagne, and I don't know, 20, 30 minutes later, we're out back practicing new moves. Right? He's not afraid of getting beaten. And he clearly, in my interaction, loves parties. So he's doing this because that's who he is. So I gave a TED Talk called The Fanatic. Apparently they found that too controversial a title, so it now goes by the paradox of incentive insensitivity. But if we extend that out, the reason I brought it up is we found this really interesting trend in our data. What predicted the best salespeople? wasn't the school they went to, it wasn't their grades, it wasn't the specifics on the skill sets or any of the specifics on their resume. We looked at the moment when all of the incentives disappeared, the day after the end of the sales cycle, when nobody cared. Even their VP of sales might actually get pissed if they book a sale that day and not the day before when they had to go in front of the board. Who's your best salespeople? Who consistently makes sales on that day? What was our N? 168,000 people. When technically we went through and did a Fourier analysis of the time series, and the wider it was, it's parametric. The wider it was, the better their sales volume and the better their deal quality. We looked another group looked at graduates from West Point. What predicts, not graduation rates, what predicts the rank they'll have 10 years later? So by definition, grades are graduation rank, but it turns out they didn't predict anything about performance 10 years later. It was what I would call endogenous motivation, that drive that comes from within. Its complement, exogenous motivation, which we might call sensitivity to incentives. Bonuses, threats of firing, praise from your parents, the scorn of your peers. Those were negative predictors of both. It turns out, I'm happy to send you the paper for that. So what is it that really predicts the best performers? Well, it's not just one thing. It is neither just a facet of belief-based utility nor endogenous motivation. In fact, what we found is there was a whole collection of qualities, some of which Heather referred to earlier. There are many that are not, we're always adding to this list. There was just a great paper that came out recently in PNAS about predicting life outcomes. I mentioned it at the I4J conference, and where we're looking at things like these. We're predictive of wealth accumulation, income, walking speed at age 65, predictive of a number of health outcomes. They were predictive of subjective happiness, objective measures of happiness, rates of social connectedness. So without going into any individual one, I'm happy to talk about them offline. General cognitive ability, social skills, metacognition, self-regulated learning, emotional intelligence, and creativity. None of these should come across to any of you as a huge surprise, except to say, this was it. Nothing else was meaningfully predictive in terms of the quality of work people did. And then this parallels my work in education. These are the things that are predictive of long-term outcomes in kids. The development, why are they on this list? 1, they are highly predictive of long-term outcomes. 2, they are well defined in the research literature. So in other words, who knows what the hell creativity really is, but construct creativity exists in the literature and it can be measured. And 3, every one of these are intervenable. They can all be changed about someone. General cognitive ability you can really only change in the first 5 to 8 years of life, but that's 5 years that for some reason we punted on in the United States. If you can get in there and change people's working memory span, literacy, numeracy, you will change their life. And by the way, without intending to, we do the exact opposite to millions of kids around the world every year through high household stress, lack of exposure to rich language experience, and childhood social isolation. So it is possible to change people. It is possible to build these qualities into our workforce. And if we're looking at this giant split between people who are a pair of legs to carry around an AI wand and people whose creative labor is in crazed demand amongst the limited number of companies willing to hire, that have the means of hiring them, this is what differentiates which of those 2 labor pools someone will enter. These are largely culturally invariant. They are largely globally invariant. They're as true in China, in Western China, as they are in San Francisco. There are some interesting nuances there, and the real question, though, is the reason we don't use these to hire is they're all latent, which is they're all hidden. You can't just look on someone's, right? The degree from Stanford or from Harvard or from École Politique is a statement, I have these qualities, hire me. Sometimes that statement is wrong, but it's actually the opposite error, which is the big problem. At Guild, we looked at how many people did we rate as top in the performance in their area, and then first we looked at who had the credentialing that matched it and those who didn't. And we found there were 10 to 100 times as many people in each job vertical that didn't have those credentials, but were equally qualified. And that is a tremendously scary story for me, but one we can intervene on. I'm already out of time, which means telling you one solution I've worked on, a system for parents to help their kids. But I'll simply say, essentially, yes, it is possible to use AI for these sorts of tasks. What we do is we try and infer, we can analyze the artwork from the kids. Sorry to anyone who built a psychological career around doing something like that, but we do it for free in a throwaway app. We can ask parents questions, and from that infer the state of these latent attributes about the kids, and then we provide to them each night an activity they can engage in with their children, specifically designed to develop these targeted meta-learning constructs. So let me finish with this, since I'm still way over time, and I'm really going fast through the actual content of my talk. The way I see it going forward, this is the only job description. It won't be salesperson, it won't be software engineer. I have friends that make AIs, so I don't see coding. There may have been a point at which coding looked like it would disappear and wouldn't. I definitely see it disappearing as a work-a-day skill. Just writing base code is not very, but this, creative, adaptive, not even a problem solver, but someone who knows which problems are worth exploring. That's the only job that I need you useless bags of organic material for, is to be explorers. And if we don't build an educational system to create that across all of our workforce, everybody from the start, and then an enlightened hiring system that actually looks for those qualities and selects them from around the world, then I am very, very disheartened that we are headed for the switch. Thank you.
Just wondering how much these things can be taught. I mean, you talk about certain qualities like working hard when you're not will need to.
So taught is a funny way of thinking about it. Clearly, I can't give you a pamphlet. There's no 6-week job retraining course for this. I'm a neuroscientist. The way you change people is you rewire their brain. The way you rewire their brain is by giving them rich personal experience extended over time. That's the beauty of having a public education system. Isn't that, over the course of a quarter or a semester, I can teach you how to factorize a polynomial. Perfectly good task as someone whose life is essentially an applied mathematician. But the real beauty of the public education system is I've got you for 15 years. Ideally, I should have you for 25 years. And I have the chance over the scope of that to change who you are for the better. And that's so loaded. The word better, building better people is loaded. But if we don't tackle some of the hard sort of ethical questions here about making decisions for other people, right? I'm not deciding what job people should do. I'm simply saying we should make a commitment towards developing these qualities. And again, every one of them is up here because there's repeatable empirical research showing that they can be changed. We should endeavor for that essentially to be the signal. And the rest of the education system is kind of just a carrier for it.
Yes, Joe? No. Yeah, Jonathan Gruden from Microsoft. Thank you. A nice talk. I just wanted to mention, as maybe a depressing note, last month the National Bureau of Economic Research released a paper on, it was a cross-cultural comparison of Chinese and American students on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and found, so you're nodding like you've seen it?
Yeah.
So just found a big, the students in the United States were highly extrinsically motivated, and the Chinese students weren't. It's a nice study.
So it's a great study, and it's one to make you worried. To complement that, let's point out that a lot of the students I suspect that they were looking at were based in places like Shanghai. right now, there are 60 million Chinese kids in what amounts to a de facto orphanage system that takes care of the kids of all of the parents that are working in the giant factory towns. And those kids show 25% show learning developmental delays, 40% show motor development. This looks like Romania in the 90s, except it isn't. This is larger than the school-age population in the United States. So China is a perfect example of a wildly bifurcating society, which I believe the Chinese government knows, but we're about to start a project jointly with LEGO and UNICEF, and we specifically want to target rural and Western China. And the government doesn't want us to. They want the whole thing to go everywhere. Well, if you don't focus on the people that actually need it, the one thing I've learned in educational technology, you want to know whether you're making a difference, I have a very simple rule. You're not. You're almost certainly making things worse. And the reason is, the very people that need your help the most won't use it. And the people that don't will make the most use of it. And you will simply increase educational inequity around the world. And that is the overwhelming story of all of my competitors and my own companies is the same thing. How do you create engagement among families that don't believe it will pay off? So it is a very similar story in China.
We need to move on. I'm sorry. Thank you again.